very much, Professor Garges, for this very nice, friendly introduction. Yes, I have very fond memories of Delhi in 2014 and other visits to India. Too bad I can't be there right now, but so are the circumstances. Yes, indeed, I want to be talking about grammaticality. I have my own individual take on this, if you so wish. I'm not really an expert on language teaching. This is really very much from the linguistics perspective. So I hope the audience will be able to relate to that and enjoy it, but we'll have to wait and see. What I want to be talking about is essentially unusual patterns, constructions which are a little off the beaten track, and then the question of how do we deal with them? What does that tell us about creativity, complexity, usage, and stuff like that? And in the very end, a few thoughts on language teaching, but that's really not my expertise, as I said. I was in Singapore earlier this year, and they had a program which I enjoyed very much at the Theatres on the Bay called All Things New, outdoor performances by young artists at the stage, which I've highlighted here. And what I found interesting, amongst very many other things, was this phrase, all things new. It is somewhat unusual, and that's, I think, intended. It does attract attention. That's its purpose. And the question why is quite simply, it's not really wholly ungrammatical, but it's definitely somewhat irregular. That's my point. Unusual, it doesn't quite follow mainstream rules. It does illustrate linguistic creativity. It probably tells us a little, and that's what I hope to be showing, on how language works. And therefore, I think such an example can be interesting from the perspective of linguistic theorizing. So I want to be talking about this and two other constructions which I think are a bit off the beaten track, linguistic patterns which are creative, unusual, rare, but nevertheless possible, not wholly ungrammatical. You may disagree, we'll have to wait and see. Creative, unusual patterns which invite specific interpretation processes and build associations with other contexts and constructions. That's what I would like to highlight. And what do these constructions then teach us about the nature of, well, language with a capital L here, intendedly, linguistic knowledge, language processing, and also do these constructions or these ideas then have consequences for language teaching. These would be my other two examples. The first one, I guess, is familiar to everybody. I call it the McDonald's construction. I'm loving it. Promotional slogan that's been around for 20 years or so. That, at least in the very beginning, clearly was equally attention-grabbing for the very same reason, because it's slightly ungrammatical or completely ungrammatical, definitely commercially successful. I want to be getting back to that. And the second one is something distinctively South Asian in the English. Is there you have what has been termed the intrusive as construction. The template is called as Mahal, for instance. Similarly, creative, unusual patterns. The question is clearly, are they quote unquote correct or not? The point I'm trying to make is they build associations, they invite specific interpretations. They tell us something about what it means for language to be creative. We do produce structures that are innovative, that hadn't existed before. So there is the option for linguistic creativity in addition to literary creativity. Our great mentor, the late Professor Braj Kachru, has always highlighted literary creativity as indicative of what he called the norm developing character of countries in the outer circle. I built that idea into the dynamic model, which Professor Ravinder kindly mentioned as part of phase 4, and the normative stabilization is also marked, amongst other things, by literary creativity, employing these varieties. And there is some recent work and thinking on creativity. There's a book by Pitzel in which he shows that in lingua franca usage, people use language constructions in creative ways. It's a recent article by the great John Widdowson on what he calls creativity of common talk. It may be related to what in other contexts I call grassroots English, specifically functional utterances, but that's possibly a slightly different story. In any case, we have deviant structures from mainstream linguistic expectations, which invite creativity, specific interpretations. What does that tell us about how language works? Essentially, we believe that grammar tells us the rules to which language conforms. That's necessary, and I'm not challenging that. But as these three creative constructions show, rules aren't quite absolute. They can be bent, they can be modified, even violated under appropriate circumstances. Precisely 100 years ago, one of our early great predecessors, the American linguist Edward Sapir, published, amongst very many other things, the wise statement, widely quoted, "All languages leak," meaning something like all rules allow exceptions. There is the possibility of creative, innovative usage, and that's very often the cradle of something new, of change, for instance. The question is, how do grammatical theories handle this insight? A very brief survey on what it means to be correct, or how do we think about language. Our teaching basically goes back to what's been traditionally called traditional grammar, modeled upon ancient European languages, especially Latin and Greek, which forms the basis of school grammars. Words are subdivided into classes, parts of speech. A word is a noun, a verb, an adjective, or whatever. They show categories like number, or person, or gender, or tense, typically by inflectional endings. And that's where the problem starts, because Latin is rich in endings, but English has very few of them. And for deviant patterns, I guess the standard statement would quite simply be prescriptive attitude to creative patterns are considered erroneous mistakes, period. 20th century saw structuralism as one of the major schools, viewing language as a synchronic system after Saussure and Bloomfield and very many other great figures, essentially arguing that language consists of systematic relationships between sequences of classified abstracted units. So determiner plus adjective plus noun would be a basic structure for a noun phrase. This old man, my beautiful wife, etc. Surface-oriented, very influential and useful methodologically, but it disregards whatever there may be underlyingly, as Chomsky argued, a bit on the rigid side, disregarding creativity, if I did that correctly. Chomsky in his generative grammar, as most of you would probably know, wanted to account for the human language faculty, and he defined competence as the goal of linguistics, language knowledge of an ideal speaker in a homogeneous speech community. There is no such animal. Everybody lives in real life environments, adjusts their styles, talks to human people. So this is really far removed from reality, I think, and it came even more so, beginning with universal grammar through principles and parameters into abstract move alpha or whatever. To my mind, it's been a highly abstract rule rewriting exercise. Generatives will please excuse me. And I think the grounding in real life behavior in reality is very limited. There are two younger schools which I'd adhere to, which I find very realistic, convincing approaches, offering an answer to the creativity question and possibly a solution to these puzzles of these slightly unusual constructions. Viewing language as a complex dynamic system that's still in the making, if you so wish, and the usage-based paradigm, which is fairly well established, associated also with construction grammar. Complex dynamic systems, that's a framework that comes from the sciences and has been very successful also in the social sciences. Mathematically, it builds on nonlinear equation systems, which, for instance, in the end explains some occasional qualitative leaps. And it's very widely adjusted, adapted, and accepted nowadays, if I see that correctly, in the natural and social sciences. Essentially, such a system is described by being perpetually in motion, always changing, in flux. There are sub-elements, parts which are relatively well ordered, a small number of clearly functionally assigned units, but there are also subsystems which are absolutely unstable, disordered, chaotic. Chaos theory is one of its precursors. It's a very large set of agents, associations, hierarchy levels, and by combining these hierarchy levels, something more powerful than just the sum of their parts, something with a new function is built in constant interaction with other factors and with the environment. So complex systems are, in a sense, perceived as auto-emergent and self-organizing. In linguistics, we had this idea of this invisible hand. That's about the specific application, I think. There are a couple of publications, earlier ones, most importantly, Bill Kretschmer's book. I don't want to run through all this. I had my own say in a small number of publications. I think in linguistics, it's definitely not a mainstream line of thinking, but it's growing. A couple of colleagues and scholars who suggest that that's the way language fundamentally also works. The real life manifestation of all this, I think, is a mainstream approach today, usage-based linguistics, understood essentially as opposed to the abstract system of generativism. I think it brings these complex systems principles to life and suggests a down-to-earth manifestation of these relatively abstract thoughts. I'm suggesting 2 books, which I really find very convincing, very accessibly Joan Bybee's, and a very fundamental, comprehensive, but a difficult read, which inspired me partly to these ideas, is Schmid's Dynamics of the Linguistic System with Oxford Press last year. The basic idea is at the core of language is really usage, the constant interaction, the fact that we keep talking to each other, and that's shaped by its functional needs and properties. Communicative contexts define what we do, and in very general terms, cognitive principles, domain general principles derived from cognitive linguistics, like a few of those which I've listed here, play a role. Analogy, simplification, but it's also perception, up and down and things like that ultimately translate into specific linguistic constructions. Language is a constant interaction and interchange between talking and hearing, if you so wish, intake, the forms, the utterances that we hear from others and that we process in our brains and integrate into our own mental knowledge system, and our own performance, which contributes to that usage and influences others in much the same way. There's a constant interaction of utterances which are shaped by our mental knowledge, but at the same time shape it. So it's really a loop, a feedback process. All of this is very strongly determined by contexts and contexts. So it's situation bound and associated with other language forms in the vicinity, a conventionalized way of encoding more or less specific or more or less abstract ideas. If you take these 2 examples, good morning, or also more specifically one for the road, those who know the phrase would exactly know what the situation is like that I would be uttering it. And that's tied into this conventionalized licensed type of construction. So we have associations between the needs in context, the functions that we want to express, and conventionalized expressions that builds in the course of time from our acquisition incrementally through interaction and usage and becomes conventionalized in the community and in the long run through constructions even more abstracted. In fact, conventionalization and entrenchment are the 2 main perspectives of the manifestations of usage. One in the community. On the community level, we have shared associations that grow and spread, and that in much the same way, not absolutely identically, but very similarly, are then functionalized in people's minds. And on the individual level, we have entrenchment. Associations get memorized, they get ingrained in our brains through repetition, frequency, and they're physiologically realized. That's the claim of usage-based linguistics, through neural connections which are built between synapses in different regions of the brain. So ultimately, they should have a physical reality, if you so wish. And language then is a shared set of such conventions, associations, situation-grounded meanings, which translate into conventionalized utterance types, which express these meanings and needs. And grammar describes these relationships, and the kind of grammar that we focus on, especially in language teaching, are precisely these associations, most importantly, the strongest, the regular ones. That, of course, is important in teaching. Focus on what comes up regularly. Don't look into marginal, rare phenomena. The point is just we need to know that the strongest, the regular, the common grammatical patterns and associations aren't the only ones. It's an ongoing, continuous process, and these creative associations are rare. They may not be licensed as yet, but they offer the potential for growth and for change, and somewhere there must be the cradle of change in language evolution. in the long run. And that, I think, applies to the three constructions that I want to be talking about. So having laid something like a theoretical, if you so wish, groundwork, let me return to these three constructions, which I introduced and call slightly unusual. I call them the ATN construction, which is precisely this sequence which I encountered, all things new. There's McDonald's construction, I'm loving it, and the intrusive as construction. Something is called as something else. And the question is, why do these patterns have their distinctive properties? Why are they perceived as strange, unusual, grammatically questionable, but at the same time, somehow, at least the first two, possibly attractive, attention-grabbing? What associations, conventionalized associations, do they trigger? Let me start with this all things new ATN construction. A very standard preliminary structural analysis would say, well, it's a sequence of an indefinite quantifying pronoun, the word all, a noun form in the plural, things, and an adjective in its base form new, a determinant noun adjective. All things would be the core of a noun phrase, determinant the head noun. Things new, well, it's apparently the relationship between a noun and its modifying adjective, but adjectives typically don't post modify, so that's the unusual thing. All new things would be perfectly fine, not worthy of any note, but all things new violates this prototypical thing and is somewhat deviant. Is it really noticeable, rare, unusual? Well, we have, for instance, as one of our major tools at our hand, corpus linguistics. We have these huge electronic text collections nowadays, which we can screen with appropriate software and check, do these constructions occur elsewhere? Are they really not used or rarely used? I did that for a couple of standard corpora. For the first set, so-called mega word corpora, 1 million word corpora of the so-called international component, ICE, International Corpus of English, or Brown and Law, British and American English. The simple question is, in a handful of these corpora, 1 billion words each, this sequence, all things new, doesn't occur at all, not a single occurrence. Second one that I looked at amongst Davis's humongous corpora is COCA, Contemporary American English, 1 billion words, by now even larger than that. And in this entire set, I found 5 tokens of this construction. Spring is filling the air with all things new, superior knowledge of all things new and trendy. And notice it's coordinated here, that is important. There are a few other similar patterns which are something different, like all things New York. It's really just a chance coincidence. And I'll get down to what I call the revelation construction a little later. But fundamentally, the point is 5 tokens out of 1 billion words. That's not many. And you can look into Globy from the same context, almost 2 billion words, 20 national varieties represented. The result is similar. I get 35 tokens of this construction, like here from New Zealand, the Matakari star constellation marked the time for starting all things new. From Pakistan, but with all things new, you need to do whatever. From Singapore, interested in telecom, etc., and all things new in technology. So again, same story. It does occur. It's not radically new. It does exist. It didn't have to be freshly coined in that Singaporean context, which triggered my observation. But given this magnitude, we can, I think, agree it is extremely rare. It's not conventionalized, entrenched, or whatever. It does leave room for linguistic creativity. And then the question for me is, what kinds of associations does this construction build, unorthodox, unlicensed as it is? We need to parse it, understand it actively, and think about it, do something with it. And the question is, what do we then associate with it? It evokes a family of constructions, similarities, properties, associations of other related patterns. Builds associations, recognitions of similarity on the side of speakers. Very simply, first and foremost, on the word level. People we know that all is something like some and several, and things is similar to and behaves like facts and thoughts, and new is similar to old and nice and so on. It helps if you've studied grammar, but you don't have to. Children don't. In language acquisition, we don't. In natural acquisition, we don't. So we don't really need to know that's a noun, an adjective, or whatever, but nevertheless, we parse, we understand the similarities in behavior in our brains. The syntactic surface relationship, post-modifying adjective, is dispreferred in English. Question is it totally ungrammatical? And I checked the big Quirk et al. Grammar, the comprehensive grammar of English. You can look into others, you'll find the same thing. There are very specific contexts in which an adjective can post-modify its head noun in English. So again, it's possible, but it's rare and it's limited to specific conditions. After indefinite compound pronouns, somebody tall, some institutional frequencies, a president-elect and attorney general, in a few set phrases, the sum total. After a superlative, the best person available. In heavy constituents, that's what we had in the corpus examples, if you remember that. An instrument difficult to play, a mistake typical of beginners. When the adjective itself is post-modified, then it won't fit in front of the noun. French has it as well, of course. Well, the ATN construction is something different. It doesn't satisfy any of these constraints, but it does build associations. I think there are relationships, and we don't perceive it as totally alien. We can analyze it in alternative syntactic ways. There are associations to other constructions which it clearly builds. For instance, it could be an abbreviation of all things are new with the copula omitted, subject, complement. Standard English doesn't allow that quite clearly. We need our copula. On the other hand, we know that in informal non-standard usage, in many first language dialects, in pidgins and creoles, also in child language acquisition, the copula is often omitted. That's a very basic cognitive principle of predication, attribution. Something is something, we don't need to say is in that context. Render all things new, make all things new, an object plus object complement, a so-called complex transitive predication after Quirk and others. Something like moving the subject complement to the object position, downgrading it. I'll get back to this revelation construction, which I mentioned before. That clearly is also a related pattern. And more widely, we do have the option of modifying the word order in English. It's basically very strict, as we know, but there can be marked word order. So new things can become things new under specific circumstances. We have subject, verb, object, but I can still say linguistics I love, and literature, let's not talk about that, things like that. Yeah? We also have the possibility of end focus for heavy constituents. So yes, we can be creative. It's unusual. We're not normally, but we can be. So much for syntax. There are a couple of interesting, I think, semantic situational associations that this phrase triggers, and my images are from the promotional video and from the respective contexts. The program was featured by Esplanade in January at the beginning of a new year. So it's something new, a new year, the first month looking ahead. In our cultures, we associate that with New Year's resolutions. So in these two screenshots, the promotional video also explicitly relates to New Year's resolutions and resolutions for what's to come. So a semantic context which is built explicitly. In February, Esplanade had Chinese New Year, which happened in that month. So that's not coincidence, I think. Another point is it's not only January, it was the January of 2021 in Singapore. Well, sadly, in between this has changed drastically, but it was something like a post-COVID perception, a new return to normalcy. In Singapore, it had a very severe so-called circuit breaker lockdown. And just a couple of days before that program started, the country moved into what they call phase 3 of reopening. So public music performances, like the ones that I'm talking about, became permitted with safe distancing measures and everything, but still it was a possibility. And that's also what the promotional video explicitly, indirectly invokes. You had to be frugal and you craved for something, but now something new is coming up after the severe COVID phase. So I think that's also not coincidence. And new, of course, also relates to the performers. Young, fresh, local bands. In very general terms, I think this ATN construction evokes what's called semantic prosody associations, which is very positive, thoroughly uplifting, inviting, a supportive, a positive attitude, something pleasant. Also adhered to in the promotional video, dream big, go ahead. That's also built into, for instance, the co-occurrences of the tokens in the corpora that I looked at in Globi, for instance. All things new co-occurs for passion. Repeatedly, you have a passion for all things new, or adjectives like trendy or appetite for spring fills the air and so on. So definitely it's a positively loaded phrase, semantically speaking. And it's associated possibly with a specific stylistic context. Post-nominal positions of adjectives in the English-British culture, in this case, tend to be marked for poetic language. Here's an example from Hopkins: all things counter, original, spare, strange, etc. So syntax may signal a specific style level, culturally, semantically, specific kinds of implications. The strongest example now is this revelation construction that I referred to originally, relevant because it's not that infrequent in corpora, at least, identical on the surface, but very difficult in terms of its syntactic and situational embedding and parsing. Make all things new, God will make all things new, is a phrase from the Bible in the book of Revelation. Syntactically, a complex transitive verb complementation construction with the object things and the object complement new. Situationally, very strongly tied to religious context, Christian writing and thinking, a biblical source. Variety specifically, people would know that this is strongly American. If you are into that at all, there are very many American songs, musical groups, children's books, etc., with precisely that title. So there is a religious association there. My question was, can you trace that in Singapore? And my answer is simply a question mark. Yes, you have Christians, of course, about 18% of the population. And if so, then the majority of those are relatively conservative American churches like Baptists and so on. They are likely to know the Bible. The band which you see performing here is called Saints Amongst Sinners, so that also resonates on Christian vocabulary. There is some association possible with this Christian context, though I would suggest in Singapore it's likely to be not very strong because culturally Christianity isn't that fundamental in that particular location, not really encouraged. And overall, it's also a very multimodal approach. Our senses play a role in also language processing. And in this particular case, for instance, it's about music, the songs and lyrics. There's a brochure that supports the program. There are on-site posters, on-stage banners. There were announcements in the media advertising this program. There's a promotional video on YouTube, of which I showed you some selections. So it's really richly built, integrated into a network of activating various human senses, which boosts this target phrase beyond its specific environment in some ways. My second example, the McDonald's construction, I'm loving it. Probably the most controversial of the things that I'll be talking about. Grammatically speaking, the standard analysis seems straightforward. This is a verb in the progressive form where basically the progressive form isn't permitted. The progressive goes with dynamic verbs. I'm doing it, I'm reading it, that's fine. Stative verbs in English only allow a plain form. I know it, I hate it, I love you, but no progressive forms with that. In that sense, the construction clearly is unusual. It also attracted attention, which I think is its purpose, because it clashes conditions, conventions. Some linguists would say builds what's called a cognitive dissonance. It violates, I would say mildly, but you may disagree, a grammatical rule of standard English. Stative verbs don't allow a progressive form. I'm handling it is fine. I'm knowing it is impossible. I'm loving it. Well, I've marked it by a combination of impossible and a big question mark. The conservative assessment would be simply grammatically unacceptable. It's incorrect. Don't do it. But notice it's not impossible. It's done. You find it. You can Google it. And if you Google something like, is McDonald's, I'm loving it grammatically correct, you find a number of very interesting responses. Some accepted, very many are highly emotional. Largely, not exclusively, respondents would be negative. So there's a selection. Technically, somebody would say this phrase represents bad grammar. That's, of course, a very negative statement. One association would be, is love really a static verb exclusively, like no, for instance? There are verbs in English which are both, which have a static and a dynamic meaning. Take think. I think she's great. That is static. I hold an opinion about her in my mind and it doesn't change. I'm thinking of you, that's dynamic. I'm revolving something in my mind, so I can use it in the progressive. Would love fit into that category? Not quite, but it's moving into that direction. Love is supposed to be a prototypically static, permanent statement. I love you. Can it be translated into something dynamic, marginally temporary? If your wife tells you, I'm loving you, then I guess there's reason to be careful, because the implication is it's going to be terminated at some point. It's for now, but not static. There are semantic associations, paradigmatic relationships with very many other similar positive emotional verbs. I'm loving it for McDonald's is something similar to enjoying it, I'm craving it, etc., etc. So it's not that totally alien, although, as shown before, very many people would believe it ungrammatical. There is a stylistic association, which is explicitly marked by the spelling, the apostrophe, which suggests that rather than an alveolar, we have a velar nasal at the end. And that's typical, as we know, of informal style, especially in the North American context. It marks a relaxed and informal situation. You behave like that linguistically when you're together with friends, when there's no need for being formal, for upholding decorum. And there's also something positive. We enjoy being together with our friends and associated with the semantics of love. But of course, if you think only standard formal usage is correct, then that is negatively evaluated. It's not that rare, interestingly enough, especially if you look into world Englishes, including Indian English. The construction type is known to be used fairly widely. This is the relevant map from the electronic World Atlas of Varieties of English. You can produce it yourself. It's generally freely accessible on the web. Progressives with stative verbs, for example, I'm liking this, what are you wanting, etc. And you see that there are in fact quite a number of varieties to various degrees and variety types where you find that. Interestingly enough, I found one post on the web where somebody argued, in fact, that was an attempt by McDonald's to Indianize their slogan. Apart from what the person said, it's promoting horrible spelling, loving being American slang. But it was argued this is Indian English, which it may be. India is clearly one of the countries in which, in some contexts, the use of progressives with stative verbs does occur, whatever one thinks of it. I don't think it's a good business strategy. I don't think McDonald's wanted to highlight the Indian connection in using this construction because the product is marketed globally, but it's also one possible perspective and association, of course. My last example, this intrusive as construction, the main template is called as Ramhal. Nihalani was the first who observed and described it. It's known to be found fairly widely in South Asian Englishes, India, Sri Lanka, not at all in British or American English. And it's mainly found with the verb call, although not exclusively. I quote Yadurajan, the use of as with call is a very common construction in Indian English. The correct construction is, of course, without as. That's the prescriptive exonormative orientation. There are some publications on this recently, most importantly, a comprehensive study published 2016 by Lange in World Englishes, and then a study by Sedlacek in a book on Asian English newspaper language. I had something on spread and diachrony. It does invite associations, again, of course, syntactically, as connects an object and an object complement. And that's something which is found fairly widely in complex transitive verb complementation following the Quirk grammar. I regard him as my friend. He considers himself as an expert. These are perfectly fine constructions in standard English with certain verbs only. And the grammatical analysis, especially with this as pattern, is a little on the strange side. Some people call them small clauses. Is as a preposition here. Essentially, it has a copular-like function. It was called predicative as in an earlier publication. I called it qualifying as. It clearly relates to the subject-subject complement relationship, which prototypically is expressed by is. A is a B. He's an expert. He's nice. That can be manifested in various ways in dependent object clauses. He considers himself to be an expert. He considers himself an expert. He believes he is an expert and considers himself as an expert. And as, in a sense, is something similar to the copular. Indian English extends this pattern to a couple of other verbs. Mostly call, as we know, very strongly, interestingly enough, as the table down here shows, term, also name and rename, and a few others. And it's also slightly stylistically associated. This is from Lange's work. The percentage of all constructions which have this as in there. And as you can see, in the case of term, it's very high, although the verb isn't that frequent. In call, it's stable. In name, it's fairly common. It's more spoken than written. Some other verbs don't do it and don't allow it. It's been growing in Indian English. This is a small-scale study of mine. We have two corpora 25 years apart, not quite, of Indian English, the Kolhapur corpus and the East India corpus, which are comparable, both written. I only looked at the written component. Again, the percentage of all clauses of these verbs in this construction, with or without as, and we see clearly that the percentage with as is increasing from 5 to 11% in the case of call, from 42 to 71 in the case of name. So yes, it's apparently a construction which has been growing in importance and diffusion in Indian English, an increasing association with these core legumes, if you so wish. There are other explanations. Schneider, for instance, suggested it's a pervasive characteristic of Dravidian English, probably motivated by the fact that Dravidian languages have a similar kind of construction with verbs of saying, possible, maybe a possible root, possibly a reinforcing association, although we find this construction not only, although strongly, in the Dravidian-speaking region. It's an interesting suggestion and idea. And that's clearly this regional association that I mentioned earlier. You find that in other South Asian varieties as well. These are all examples from Lange. In Nepal, a system declares a majority of its students as failures, and in Maldives, Maldives has been named as the Indian Ocean's leading tourist destination. Pakistan, this association called the export target as quite ambitious. Bangladesh named as the acting power secretary, and so on. Variably different lexemes. High proportions are found in Bangladesh as well, somewhat lower elsewhere, but it's also regionally characteristic overall. Getting to the end, I realize it's been a tour de force. It's a very minute linguistic observation, slightly unusual construction, which took me to some very broad reflections on linguistic theory and associations of all kinds. One point that I'd like to make is something like essentialism fails. There's not really any point in asking what kind of a structure is, with a capital A, if you so wish, the ATN construction and McDonald's construction. Even the question, is it correct or not? Well, that adheres to standard social evaluations, teaching contexts. Yes, you need some directions, but the very fact that it's around and people use it and people understand it cannot be denied. It's part of our linguistic repertoire. It activates various associations. These associations contribute to our understanding, to the effectiveness of these phrases. They resonate with our linguistic knowledge in general, with attitudes, with emotions, with extra-linguistic contexts and exceptions. I think the complex system view, the usage paradigm would fit very nicely to explain that, to show us how language works and how these constructions build in our minds and in our communities. Other questions, whether they're correct or not, are different. My only slide, I'm afraid, on pedagogical implications. I'm not an expert. I leave that to you, the audience. A couple of ideas just. Language is not mathematics. It's not only yes and no and right and wrong. It is manipulating options and handling things in finely graded ways. It's about more or less of the same or slightly different. There is something which clearly is the target of teaching, conventionalized, frequent, correct. But there are also margins of all this, which can be widened circumstances, coined under specific circumstances. Language does allow for creative interpretation and production. Whether the strategy of marking deviance as plainly wrong is therefore recommendable is questionable. You can think about that. Is it possible to teach awareness of associations, similarities, relationships between constructions in addition to the real common core? I would think it's useful for at least advanced students to develop a sense of a focus on the one hand, what's regular, frequent, normal, of course, but also be aware of the possibility that there are options which are rare, unusual, creative, you name it. So communicative strategies to build such associations and generate awareness of them, I think, should be part of at least advanced language teaching. Explain things, paraphrase things, ask back if somebody doesn't understand, try to relate various types of utterances, constructions to each other, etc., etc. But as I said, that's something that I really have to leave to you, the practitioners. If you're interested in my slides, I'll be happy to share them in whatever way. Drop me a note, or I can pass it on to Penchanan or to the organizers. For now, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.